I'm joined today by Cherokee scholar Julie Reed to talk about her powerful book, Land, Language, and Women. This is a work that asks us to rethink what sovereignty really means, not as an abstract political idea, but as something rooted in place, carried through language, and sustained by women's knowledge and labor across generations. Julie Reed writes at the intersection of Indigenous studies, gender, history, and lived experience. In Land, Language, and Women, she shows how Cherokee women have been central to the survival of culture and nationhood, especially through moments of dispossession, removal, and forced assimilation. This is not just a book about the past. It's an ongoing work of care, resistance, and responsibility. Today, we talk about land not as property, but as relation, about language as a living practice rather than a symbol, and about why women's voices are so often at the center of cultural continuity and so often marginalized in historical narratives. Julie also reflects on what it means to write as a Cherokee woman today and what this history asks of all of us in the present. This is a thoughtful, challenging, and deeply moving conversation. I'm Jason Herbert, and this is A Reckoning. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is A Reckoning. Okay, so here's the first thing I wanted to get out and open in the air. My best friend has raved about you as long as I have been friends with my best friend. And she is sitting someplace in Indiana, freezing her tail off tonight, I'm sure. So wherever Crystalline is, I hope that she is freezing. And you've now been on the pod as many times as she has now, to come think about it. So congratulations. Welcome to the podcast. So
thank you.
I need to give her help. How is Crystalline Shefflin only been on this pod one time?
Exactly.
One time.
Yeah, she has a new edited volume out.
She's productive and phenomenal and brilliant.
Yeah.
And we're going to have Fletcher edit all of those nice things I said out about her in just a few moments. So, okay, so I was just telling you before. Okay, so here's the thing. Usually when we do this podcast, I have a whole lot of banter before we hit record. But Julie, I was so excited about having my first real conversation with you. I wanted to get all of this on. So I was like, hey, Julie, let's hit record. Because I'm so excited to talk to you about your book, your work. Oh my God, this book. Julie, this book. It's the first thing I've read of yours. And I have been posting about it and telling people about it. It's sitting right here. Now it's in my hands for people listening. I love this so much. So thank you. No, thank you so much for being here. Where the hell are you is my first question. You're on the road.
So I am currently living in Silva for the semester. Silva, North Carolina. I'm at Western Carolina right now, taking classes. But I'm in Knoxville right now because I'm flying out of Knoxville tomorrow. But I'm permanently in Oklahoma at this point. So, where do you need me to be?
In one place, so would be great. And I feel like we need the Indiana Jones map with you with the red line bouncing from place to... What are you doing in Western North Carolina is my first question. You're taking language classes? What are you doing out there?
So I have a Mellon New Directions Award that it was my dream even before it was a possibility. And when I say dream, I literally used to dream about this award. That enables me to learn a new skill. And the goal is not necessarily to write a book, right? That isn't the Mellon's goal with this award. It's that what is a skill that would help you move forward as a scholar forever, right? What are the things you need to think about forever and ever? And after I started going in the caves, I was like, I need to understand what archaeologists do. I don't know that I want to be an archaeologist. I don't want to be an archaeologist. I'm a historian, but I want to understand what archaeologists do and how they know what they know. And Western Carolina is kind of the perfect place for that because you've got Brett Riggs, you've got Jane Eastman, you've got Ben Steer, you've got all of these people coming out of some of the best programs in Southeastern archaeology. And added to that, I get to kind of keep studying Cherokee language. So I'm taking a couple archaeology classes this semester and then a couple Cherokee language classes this semester. So more than a full load at the graduate level, and I am too old for this shit.
Okay.
And I don't know if I can say shit, but I'm going to.
You can abso-fucking-lutely say shit on this gosh darn part. Fuck it, I don't care.
Yeah.
Yeah. Later on, you'll have to come back and tell us what the Cherokee word for shit, and then we'll say it was all educational at some point in time.
Yeah, exactly.
Or I'll get Ben on. Ben will know.
Yeah,
Ben will know.
Ben will know more curse words than me. That's for sure.
I have the crazy story about Ben that I will not tell you on this podcast.
Okay.
I love that guy. He's great. And I was so happy. Okay. Anyway, all right. Before we get into this story about your book and your work, I'm so excited because I know this conversation is going to go really cool places. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you're doing here? I guess is maybe the big question. Sure.
Yeah. So I'm Julie Reed. I'm an associate professor of history and anthropology at the University of Tulsa by way of Penn State, by way of Tennessee, by way of UNC Chapel Hill for graduate work. So I'm also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. And so I consider myself an ethnohistorian first and foremost. That is how I understand what I do. And I worked with Theda Perdue and Mike Green. So I joke that I'm the academic child of a political historian and a social historian. And I, care deeply about Cherokee history and Southeastern history and the Native South and Indian Territory and Oklahoma Territory and the Cherokee Nation today. And so, that's kind of who I am.
Okay. So. What Julie did not say is goddamn rock star. Was what she was failing to say, but I can say it because it's my podcast. There's so much to unpack, and I hate that word because it's such an academic word. And I, as of last week, announced that I'm no longer an academic. But
which congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
So that's
I love the tribes out here, man. I just like
I get it.
You know what's weird? You look over my head. I'm actually hiding the Kentucky thing over here, but I've got the Comanche thing. So the people back in the nation, and I know I'm going to catch shit if people are watching back, because every time I wear a Comanche shirt, I catch crap from Shine and Arapaho. Really? You're not going to wear our colors? I'm like, really? Are we? Whatever.
Next week.
Dude, it's...
there's more than one podcast.
I love it.
You just have to keep changing up the outfit.
Yes. So, No, okay. But this isn't about me. Okay, I have another important question for you that we've kind of gotten away from on this podcast, but as a fellow Southerner, I need to ask you maybe the most important question. Coke or Pepsi? Where do you fall along these lines?
Sweet tea.
God, you've nailed that answer. That's good. Okay, good. We can continue. So out here in Colorado, they don't really do that thing. I'm struggling. It's fine. I do sweet tea.
Yeah.
All right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We have a lot to talk about here because I feel like there's this really cool, the story, your own personal history that we can talk about. I definitely want to talk about Cherokee people writ large. Julie, you are now responsible for telling us everything about Cherokee people. Congratulations for that. But there's so much, and then also the process of history, because you talked about this very important term, ethnohistorian, which is kind of how I grew up as a scholar as well, because it's you get to play in every sandbox. But we'll talk about that process too. But before we get into all that, you have written now your second book through my dream press is Land, Language, and Women, a Cherokee and American Educational History. I've read it. People are going to be reading this thing. I know everybody on the back of this book. They're blurbing you. Why did you write this? Why now? What? This is your second book. What was the gestational thing for why you had to write this story now?
Well, I mean, I always knew that the second book was going to be a book on education, even in graduate school, even when I was working on the dissertation and the first book, education in some ways should have been in the first book. If we're thinking about social welfare and we're thinking, it was an absence in the first book, but it also deserved, Cherokee education could be a multi-volume work. And I say in the book, I could have written it a very different way and actually had planned to write it a very different way. And I really saw it as a kind of continuation of the first book as an institutional history. Like, let's lay out all the schools and how they emerged and who taught there and which communities they served. And so I saw it very much as a continuation of that first project. But the other piece that kind of stuck out to me in my readers' reports in the first book, right, that kind of stay with us, but that are, not sure they're critical, but critical in a way that like asks us questions that we need to be asked. And one of them was like, where are the women in this book? And obviously, like, it wasn't that my first book was absent women, but there was this sense of like, I'm telling the story of like middle managers of institutions who are largely men. And that I was trained by Theta Purdue. Like, how is it that I didn't tell a story of women in a greater way in that first book? And so I kind of was keeping an eye toward that and kind of understood that women's labor, quite literally in terms of their economics, was a part of that story. It took, a lot longer than it should have. Like, I was, I've heard like Ari Kelman say, like, write the easy second book, right? And I thought I was doing that until I joined the Cave collaboration. And then everything fell apart, right? And came back together in a very different way. And so, what could have been the very easy book of writing another institutional history became a much more complicated book that required me to think far more deeply about schooling and education and definitions of education than I had previously. My daughter read the introduction to the book over the Christmas break, and she said, "So you mean to tell me if you hadn't gone into caves, this would have been another boring book?"
Was there time to take her off the cover of the book for saying that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I was like, it wouldn't have been boring. It just would have been different. And she's like, So, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah.
Your daughter sounds a lot like Crystalline's daughter. I'm just saying. All right. There's so much here to go into, and like you said, where are the women? Which is like every time I write, Angela Hudson goes, Jason, where are the women? Right. But let's talk. The big thing here. This is a Cherokee story, right? And that was really the big pull for me. I really try to use this pod now really as a platform to talk about Indigenous issues, things that are important to Native folk, how the things that we do, like everything, right? And the story is so goddamn cool. And especially as I got into that last chapter, I was like, oh, okay, yeah, all right. But before we get there, can we do maybe, I don't want to assume, you and I are both from the South, and I think, I grew up hearing about Cherokees in Kentucky and all this kind of stuff in like this really awful way we'll talk about in a moment. And I think people in the South are broadly familiar with maybe Cherokee history, and certainly in Oklahoma as well. But I don't want to assume that people, our large international audience, knows anything about Cherokee folk. Can we do like a Cherokee 101? Julie, who are Cherokee people? Like, what do you got?
Yeah.
You have 17 hours to respond.
That might be enough time.
I don't think so.
Yeah, so I think, there's kind of and this is some of what I lay out in footnotes, not in the book itself, right, but like that there's different ways to kind of define who Cherokees are, right? There's kind of the answer of who we as Cherokee people understand ourselves to be. And then there's anthropologist understandings of who Cherokees are. And then there's the political understandings of, so there's these different layers. I mean, I think within a Native South context that Cherokees are outliers in the sense that they're Iroquoian speakers, and that we know that there's a relationship that existed thousands of years ago between Iroquoian speakers and Cherokee speakers, and that a split occurred, so that clearly we were relatives at some point. Then we maybe didn't like each other as much. We had yeah, exactly. So we don't fit into the larger Native South in the same way linguistically, right, that Muskogean and Miccosukeen speakers do, right? And at the same time, there are kind of spiritual practices and cosmological understandings of the world that clearly show that Cherokees came in, were part of this native South world that does link them to Muskogees and Seminoles and Chickasaws and Choctaws, and that there is this larger landscape and worldview that does link many of these communities together. That is thousands of years old, and so I think there. The other thing I want to say is, like, if we're thinking about Cherokees today, we have 3 federally recognized Cherokee tribes, right? That we have the United Kidua Band, we have the Cherokee Nation, both with capitals in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and we have the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians located in Cherokee, North Carolina, and the surrounding region, right? So then we have these kind of political histories of those 3 discrete groups, right? Who are all relatives over a longer span of time. That there are ways in which kinship and clan connect many, many families, and then there are legal systems that played out over time, particularly in the 19th century, that separated out what became the Eastern Band from the Cherokee Nation. And so we look to the 1817-19 treaties to understand where that political split occurred. But for many Cherokee people today, that political split doesn't mean they don't still have kin in both places, right? So I think there's a lot of different ways to answer that question. I also think there's questions of race, and there's questions of language, and there's questions of place that come into play. That it's there's a kind of beautiful sentiment that often gets talked about by our leaders of, like, we're all of one fire, and I love that. But I'm also a historian who understands there are lots of political differences that make that kind of beautiful sentiment of connection far more complicated. And so on the one hand, I see all of us as Cherokee people being intimately connected over a long span of time, but politically, it's a more complicated story. And so when I understand Cherokee people today, I understand them as citizens and members of 3 federally recognized tribes. I also understand there are descendants that are not part of those communities. And then I also understand these longer histories of connection that are far less about politics and are more about kinship and clan. The other thing I would say is that if anybody knows anything about Cherokees, it's usually the Trail of Tears, right? And one of the reasons so many people know about Cherokees is because we had the best press, quite literally. We had the only press for a minute, right?
Yeah.
So I think people, if they know nothing else, even in the U.S., if you've only got a little bit of exposure in K through 12, it's often the Trail of Tears, right? There might be 2 other key moments in Native history that you get. And so people understand our history through this kind of, on the one hand, failure of the U.S.'s early understandings of democracy and who it was supposed to be. And on the other hand, it was like this inevitable peace that had to happen in order for the U.S. to continue. And so, and so that is often the story that people know about us. And so, I saw my first book as a way of kind of telling a story that didn't end after removal, that really needed to tell a story of, like, survivance after removal. But I also see this book as one that hopefully does a job of seeing these longer connections that exist between all Cherokee people over a longer span of time, even as I'm taking into account these changes that have led to 3 political bodies existing.
So as you're talking, I'm thinking, I'm now mentally doing the map because I had the privilege of being able to do some work at the Cherokee Archives in Tahlequah when I was at Wichita State. And, I've been to Cherokee. I know, I've been to the museum over there. I slipped and nearly busted my butt. No, I did bust my butt near that waterfall. It was December. Don't go in December if you're me. Oh my gosh, it's so pretty. I have to ask you this, Julie, because I don't know who else to ask at this point. And it's the thing that's always deeply bothered me. Growing up in Kentucky as a white guy, as a settler family, and our family moved in 19th century into Western Kentucky, Western Tennessee. And there's always, Julie, these stories of our Cherokee I'm putting this in quotation, our Cherokee princess great-grandmother, right? And it's not just the Chadwick family of Western Kentucky either that has this story. I've heard this so many times. I'll tell people, hey, I do Native history, this, that, and the other, and I'm bracing for it, Julie. Can we talk a little bit about like that mythology of like why non-Native folks in the South claim Cherokee ancestry? Like, and what that, and how is a Cherokee woman does, and you don't have to speak for the nation, but like, how does that rub you on a personal level? Like when you hear people telling these stories, does that happen to you as well?
Oh my gosh. So Ruth Ann Elmore is going to love me telling this story, but when I was a fellow at the Clements Center, we had these discussions about this Cherokee princess lore, and she was like, no, doesn't happen. Right. And speaking of falling, I fell on the steps, going up to my office one day and, needed stitches. And so Ruth Ann Elmore takes me to a clinic, an emergency clinic, to get stitches in my knee. And as the woman is stitching me up, she says, she's trying to make nice as she's, going about her business in my knee. And she says, what do you do? And I said, I'm just like you're describing. I'm a Native historian. I specialize in Cherokee history. And she says, with Ruth Ann in the room, my great-great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess. And we're in Texas, right? And so I'm like, I also don't want to be left with like a huge scar in my knee. So I'm like, I'm gonna let your great-great-grandmother stand.
Right. How about that?
Yeah.
Wow.
So yes. But I also, there's a couple ways that I think about this because I taught at Tennessee where most of my students said the same thing. And as a historian of the Native South, I go, it's possible, right? So that there's a kind of element of, sure, you could have some descendancy, like living in this area, in this region. I don't want to dismiss that outright, right? But what I will often and have increasingly asked students to do when they're in my classes is like, okay, so what does that? What does that actually mean? Like we have ancestral databases now. Who are you connected to? Like, let's do the work of beyond just kind of this individualistic claim. Which community do you connect to? Where were you at when your family connected? And very often those answers aren't coming, right? Like that there isn't much more than just kind of the lore. And so I also, as a historian, understand why and when false claims become prominent, that there isn't a one-off moment, that there have been multiple moments in Cherokee history where there was an incentive to claim Native identity, Cherokee identity, that is often monetary. And that's hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around, right? Because we've told ourselves the story of Cherokee history, but of Native history in general as being one of loss and victimhood. And so, it's often like my family hid, or, that there's a welfare component. Like my family didn't want to accept anything from the government. So we didn't get on the rolls. And I'm like, that was our land. Like, you're not accepting anything from the government. You're like, this is our legacy. This is our, so some of those don't match up, but I think, that there were whole cottage industries of attorneys at the time of removal trying to like follow up with claims from removal, right? So attorneys are going throughout the South trying to find people with the same names as other Cherokee people in order to claim money that people are entitled to for the loss of their property as a result of removal. Like, I think we need to remember that at the time of allotment, and this gets complicated around questions of even race, that at the time of allotment, there's all of these like free land, Indian land's going to be opened up, come west. And so people are showing up, laying claim to kind of a lore of a past in order to gain access to those allotment lands that are going to be distributed. And the amount of corrupt kinds of practices that white settlers and attorneys were engaged in is pretty deep. And we have good records of it. Like, we can see that people were attempting to to cheat Cherokee people out of their land, right? I also think there's, this is Phil Deloria's work kind of lays it out for us that, there's a way in which settlers have kind of been laying claim to Native identity in order to make themselves American since even before the origin of the United States, right? That this playing Indian has been something that people did. And I think this, I'm thinking about Andy Denson and Taya Miles' work on the South and remembrances of the South, that there's a way that Native identity becomes conflated with Southern identity, particularly after the kind of Civil War and lost cause narratives. And so it's like, well, we're native to this land. And I even go further than that. I mean, I talk a little bit about this in the book, that if we think about the origins, and again, Phil Deloria does this work, but others have done it as well, thinking about the Boy Scouts and the YMCA, where literally the YMCA is starting tribes across this country that hundreds of thousands of kids and their families are participating in. So at the very moment in the 1970s that the Cherokee Nation is trying to revitalize, they're competing with kids and their parents across the country who see themselves in some kind of strange way as their American identity, overlapping with like an identity of scouts or an identity of being a part of a tribe through this YMCA parent-child program. That there's just been so many times in our history where Native identity has been trotted out as either something that is economically a good thing, and therefore people want access to that money, or that makes you somehow more American. And so I think that mythology exists for some, for a variety of reasons. And so I think, though, it behooves people, and this is where, I go to with my students, is like, okay, but an individual identity is actually what has been used as a cudgel against Native people, that individualism has been used as a weapon. And so you laying claim to this identity in order to speak on behalf of Cherokee people, or in order to say that your experience is the same as a community who stayed together through incredibly harsh policies and histories, is not the same, right? So you have a responsibility to truly understand what you're saying as an individual when you lay claims to this identity. So yes, and of course the great phrase is like, that's great that you claim to be an Indian, but who claims you? Who claims you as that community? And if you don't know the answer to that, then probably you should stop laying claim to that identity until you have some more answers to those questions.
Can I ask you maybe the inverse though, Julie? Like, what about Native folks? Are there, as a scholar, and you see this in the records or in the speech? I start reading the book. I'm like, and I'm seeing who you're talking to. We'll get into that in a sec. But like, are there Native folks who are maybe walking away from that identity as well? You talk about yourself in the book as being a very fair-skinned person who doesn't necessarily pass, I guess is the right word here. Are there folks who are going, you know what? No, I want to relinquish my Native identity and pass as a Caucasian, Black, whatever, right? Does that come across too?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I do just think about this a lot in the first book, where we're thinking about this moment even before removal, right? The 1817-19 treaties are a great example, where there are provisions for those acculturated, market-driven, Christianized Cherokee heads of household, particularly men, who can kind of opt out. They can become residents of the state. Now, granted, there's a lot packed into like states honoring that, but there are lots of Cherokee people who, in that moment, are kind of making a decision about where is my nation, right? Or who are my children going to be? I mean, this is a moment where we're not totally to a kind of bilateral understanding of families. So if you're a matrilineal society that says your mom has to be Cherokee, but suddenly your mom's a white South Carolinian woman, then maybe your household's making a different decision about who they're going to be in that moment. I think the same thing is true at allotment. It's not as if all Cherokees were universally opposed to allotment. Right. Some saw a lot breaking up the lands, getting getting rid of the nation as a good thing. Was that the majority? No, it wasn't. But I do think that we have to think through these moments when both through force, a lack of choice, but also through choice, that people are making decisions in very specific moments in time that are a different kind of calculus about their relationship to Cherokee people. And so I absolutely think, and I actually think that when we're thinking about family histories, those of us that do Cherokee history or those of us who are Cherokee scholars, that we need to be really clear on where our families were at on all of these issues, right? Like, do we know what our family thought about allotment? Which side of the issue were they on? Do we know if our family took 1817, 1819 reserves because they were like, hey, I'm white passing, I'm doing well financially, I don't necessarily need the Cherokee Nation anymore? I think those are important questions that are a part of our family histories that we've got to grapple with. So yeah, I think it can work in the opposite direction as well.
You mentioned names a little bit ago, and I kind of want to talk a little bit about your very particular story because it's so relevant to talking about your life and your scholarship as a Cherokee woman, as a Cherokee mother. I don't know that Reed is a common name in Cherokee country, but names that I do recognize as Cherokee are definitely Owl, and I sure as heck recognize Smith as a Cherokee name. Can we talk a little bit about this, I guess, process of discovery? You've always been Cherokee, but you didn't know that, correct?
Well, I knew,
okay,
but I didn't know, right? Like, so,
okay.
So yeah, I mean, I've always, I don't remember ever not knowing that I was Cherokee.
Okay.
So, but my last name was Reed my entire life, right? It's still my last name. And so I knew my grandparents. I understood who my grandparents were. I knew my aunts. I visited my grandparents, pretty regularly as a kid in Oklahoma. But when we were moving from Washington State to Florida, when my dad was retiring from the military, I was helping my mom kind of sort papers and clean, and I was probably 8 at the time, and I pulled a document out of a folder, and it was my dad's original birth certificate, just a frail piece of paper. I mean, this is, the 40s. It's still being done on these old papers. And it said Smith as the last name. And I said to my mom in that moment, it stands out in my mind forever, that I said, this has the wrong name on it. Why doesn't it say Reed? I'm 8. I'm like, why doesn't this say Reed? Why does it say Smith? And my mom said, well, your dad was adopted when he was in middle school. And it was at that moment, I mean, again, knew I was Cherokee, but assumed that my grandma and grandpa Reed were that connection, right? That's where my connection came from. And I understood that my dad was not racially white. And so there was also this piece of it. And Oklahoma makes sense, right? Like, so there are these components, but in that moment, I learned that this other grandfather existed that was actually my connection to Cherokee history and to Cherokee identity. And that, I mean, I see it as like a mystery that I needed to solve. Like, how could I have not known this? Why didn't anybody tell me? And, I mean, granted, I was 8, so I was still pretty young, but that really became a problem for me that I needed to understand. And so I became kind of a family historian, picking, finding anybody who would tell me anything about why I didn't know this. And that my dad was not particularly forthcoming, that this was a harder, more complicated story for him. And so I had to go to anybody, my mom. My mom's a white woman from New York, and she becomes kind of my first teacher about my own Cherokee history. And then my dad's sister, becomes kind of my second teacher. So, these are the people that are willing to help me understand why this adoption happened, why I didn't know this. I mean, to be adopted in the middle school is pretty late. It's not like it's, he's adopted as an infant. That's a very different situation. And so it took years of my life trying to better understand what had taken place. So, all of that is to say, like, my dad had four other brothers beyond his two sisters, and they are now all a part of my life. And one of those is Chad Smith, who was the former principal chief of the Cherokee Nation.
Saw that.
And
yeah.
Yeah. So, but this was a harder, for me, this was exhilarating and exciting.
Yeah.
And that to kind of understand that there was this other part of my family that I could get to know, right? And that my dad's relationship to his father and to his own childhood was much more complicated.
I want to ask you a little bit about, you talk about the education of yourself and this kind of, I don't know if awakening is the right word here, but one of the things the book does is talk about, the recurring storyline is that Sequoia invents a syllabary and then some learning happening. And you are like, wait a second, that's not the case at all. Let's start over. You want to talk a little bit about Cherokee educational systems, like where they come from? I'm desperate to get into the caves at some point in time in this conversation. Like, let's talk about how ways of knowing. In my work in ecology, we talk a lot about traditional ecological knowledge. I don't think a lot of people understand that. Can we talk about like where people are learning the things in Cherokee culture?
Yeah. Well, so I think it's pretty, like in some ways it's totally basic, and it's not that we don't still have these learning methods that exist, right? That there's that to learn something, you can sit and you can watch and you can listen, right? That we understand that fundamentally, that I mean, I'm not a great I have yet to learn how to do some mechanical stuff by watching a YouTube video, but there are other people who can, right? They can sit and they can watch something play out and they can learn it, right? And so, I think there's a way in which we need to kind of reconceive of like just the ways that our senses allow us to take stuff in, right? So by sitting next to somebody who's really skilled at something, we can watch how their hands move. We can watch how pottery is made. We can watch how fish weirs are put together. We can watch how bows are manufactured, right? And so, I wanted to reconstruct a kind of everyday world of learning that didn't include schools, right? Because those, and I think a point we need to make more broadly about human history is that schools are really relatively young. That the ways that we understand schooling today is still relatively young, and that around the globe there are still these much older ways of still learning all sorts of things. And so I was like, how do we get to some of that? And I think we have, there are great, this is where archaeology comes in. This is where, and, a little bit of anthropology comes in. This is where I think Cherokee master artists for me came in, because again, I'm not somebody who works with my, I wasn't raised to work with my hands. I think maybe I could have, but it's just not a skill that I have. So, and part of this comes from having a mother who was very much excelled in schooling, and having a father who learned by watching or by doing, right? That these were two very different approaches to education. And so I wanted master artists to talk, to kind of help me conceptualize how you learn something that that requires certain kinds of dexterity, or requires certain kinds of where do you get clay from? What is that physically like, right? And so So I look to anthropologists and I look to master artists and I look to the kinds of things that we know existed in communities as tools and as um, processes that played out. And so then we have to look at things like pottery. We have to look at things like basketry. We have to look at things like, again, bow making. We have to look at clothing production. And then we can kind of track those changes over time because obviously that stuff doesn't stay the same. Right. But schools were watching your elders or watching very skilled practitioners of those things you wanted to excel in. I think the other kind of important thing that I think about relative to schooling is, and to education within a longer frame of time, is how truly democratic it was, right? That yes, schools in the vision of our founding fathers or founders were very much about like creating good citizens and having people who were ready for the responsibilities of citizenship. And I think education, though within a longer framework of Cherokee history, is about anybody can be a teacher or a learner at any time. And that it doesn't take somebody older to teach someone younger under all conditions. And I think for me, I learned that as a teacher. that I learned that as a public school teacher, that I think about the years that I spent in the public schools with students who had very different backgrounds from me. And I learned from being in community with them, right? That my teaching responsibilities weren't a one-way street. And so I think we understand that on some level, but we don't often think about how to take that seriously in Indigenous educational spaces. Like, what would that actually look like? And so, part of what I wanted to do was say, what would it look like to do these everyday tasks that you're expected to learn? And then from that, I also said, like, one of the core pieces of Cherokee education well into the 19th century and arguably later was Cherokee language, right? And so where are people learning the language? And where are they first hearing the language? Well, I think this is, again, not just about Cherokees. It's about who are the voices that you hear immediately in the world around you. And that's your mother. That's your aunts. That's your grandmother. That's the world of women who are swaddling you, who are feeding you, who are tending to you, or it's other children. It's your older siblings, right? And those are your earliest teachers. And so how do you learn anything else in Cherokee society if you haven't mastered Cherokee language, right? How do you understand the kind of more complex languages of ceremony if you haven't mastered the most basic understanding of what it means to be Cherokee, and that's the Cherokee language. So then it becomes easy to kind of conceive of women as being core to this. And then it helps when I have like Cherokee first language speakers today saying to me, I could never learn the language today if I hadn't been born with a mother who spoke the language. That multiple people have said that to me under very different conditions, how pivotal the women were to making them first language speakers. And so as an ethnohistorian, I'm like, I'm upstream and I'm downstream, I'm sidestream it,
I'm down. Like, so, it's our sandbox. Yes. We can play in it. We do what we want.
Yeah.
I actually want to dig in this a little bit because I don't know that many people will understand ideas of matrilineality or matrolocality when it comes to, say, Cherokee people or Cherokee culture and things like that. And I'm listening to you, Julie, and I'm kind of starting to conceptualize you actually as, wait a second, my friend is a professor. She is a teacher. She's a Cherokee mother, right? Can we talk about maybe the traditional roles of women in Cherokee society? Because like, this is a book about Cherokee women. There's some men in here, and there's definitely acknowledgement of the importance of men, but this is a story about women. Why? Like, what's the big deal about Cherokee women, Julie?
Well, I mean, okay, so this is maybe, kind of big meta is that challenge of the first book, totally. Right? Like, where are the women, right? And but I also think it's a challenge of our profession, right? So, I'm gonna say the scholarly thing, and then I'm gonna say the kind of Julie as a Cherokee woman thing. So, the scholarly thing is, I think Theta is going to get cited in any book written, certainly about Cherokees, but certainly, more broadly in the Native South. That they're going to the kind of obligatory citation is going to show up.
Mm-hmm.
But what I often see fall apart is like, but what does that actually mean in practice for people? Because it's not as if matrilineality, just because Cherokee elites are saying in the early 19th century, like, we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to rely on clans anymore. That means that all Cherokee people set it aside and it no longer matters to them. Like that, the way that I always think about this is like, just because somebody puts up a 55 mile per hour speed zone does not mean that I'm going to abide by it, right? Like that you can pass a law, but that doesn't mean that the community necessarily adheres to that completely. Or that kind of multiple systems can operate simultaneously. Sure, we can be citizens, but you might also know who in the community has a clan. And you might know whose Cherokee mother is out there. So what does it actually mean if we're trying to track more complicated changes that aren't uniform across a society, that some parts of the community are going to hold on to matrilineality and matrilocality because that's what matters to them, and others are going to resist giving up those changes? And that's not just women, right? Like one of the things I saw with the pensions in my first book was like looking at these pension records is that Cherokee men are struggling to make sense of pushes to a system that wants to privilege male heads of household, right? That wants to displace women from farming. So what does that actually do to families? What does that actually do to communities, right? And so that, I think, is where I get frustrated with those of us who say that we take seriously these ideas of matrilineality and matrilocality in the South, but then we drop it as if it just disappears, right? Or we think that's just talking about, oh yeah, this person, this very important Cherokee man had a Cherokee mom, but we don't need to know anything about her, just that she was a Cherokee woman. The sheer number of unnamed Cherokee women that stand in for Cherokee identity as we're filling out intermarried white men, like is lazy on our parts and doesn't do justice to the kind of bigger part of the biases in the records. So that's the kind of ethnohistorian side of why I think this is important. I think that the part of me that knows it's important, understands that it was important to kind of honor women is twofold. That that it's too easy to not see the kind of everyday work that people do. And I think this is not just true of women, it's true of laborers. It's true of people that do things for us all the time without being thanked, without being paid properly, without being noticed. And that matters. And how do we see people that other groups or other entities tell us aren't as important? So there's kind of I think, an importance to see people. And then I think second to that, I think part of it was just watching in my, in my own both family of both non-Cherokee women in my family, but also Cherokee women in my family who I just watch. I'm thinking about my Aunt Bobby, who's done this language work her entire life, but hasn't necessarily always been the spokesperson for language revitalization programs, right? Or, the number of people that I've turned to who have helped me with language quietly and behind the scenes. How many of them are women, who are not in these most important positions, or not out in front, but are doing the kind of quiet, everyday, consistent work of carrying parts of Cherokee history and Cherokee language forward. So I wanted us to see them too. And so it's twofold, that I think there's just ways that we look past people and that we have a responsibility to see people.
I want to go so many different ways on this conversation now. Julie, I feel like this conversation can easily go 4 hours. I'm trying so hard for it not to go that way. I'm reading your book, and I'm making these notes on my happy little notebook here, and I'm going, wonder how Wilma Mankiller fits into all this. And then I read, I talked to Wilma Mankiller. What is that about? You met Wilma Mankiller?
Yeah, I mean, so
dude,
there are two reasons that I'm a academic Cherokee historian today. Okay. So, I've said I was always kind of a family historian, and that could have continued on. I was a public school teacher for many years. That could have gone a whole other direction. Obviously Theda is a part of that. She took me on. I became a graduate student to her. So yes, I was trained, as a historian of Cherokees. But it really it's Wilma that is the reason I could even see myself as a historian of Cherokee people. And I didn't enjoy history in high school. Unfortunately, I had a lot of football coaches who, were more interested in watching game tape than, teaching me about history. Or it was a traditional kind of history. It was battles. It was presidents. It was, and I didn't see the people that I cared about or myself in that history, right? That I was like, how am I supposed to connect with any of this? I wasn't a history major in undergrad. And so it wasn't until I was a freshman at Salem College in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a women's college that has existed really since, 18th century, and was the first school to educate Cherokee, Native women in the South that was outside of Cherokee communities. And I didn't know that when I went there. I just, picked a college and went. But Wilma had done a lot of research in the Moravian archives in Winston-Salem. And when her book came out, Man Killer, a Chief and Her People, she came and gave a public lecture. And she was the first Cherokee woman I ever saw speak publicly.
wow.
And I, read her book and just thought, this is not a way of telling or reading history that I'd ever experienced before, right? That it was a book that wove personal history in with political and social history, and it fundamentally altered how I understood the ways that history could be told. And so really Wilma is my origin story, as that I could see something different in the world of history. And Theda is obviously a mentor, but without those two people, I would not be this today.
As a scholar, Theda's a legend, especially in the Native South. And Wilma, oh my gosh. I love what you just said about both of them. I want to ask you about this other thing that makes you who you are, which is land. And this idea of belonging and identity. We kind of started to touch on this a little bit. We talk about Gadua. You're talking about the caves. Can we talk about, so many people know about Cherokees, as you said, about the Trail of Tears. All they know about Cherokees is that they left, and then we stopped hearing about them. And we don't hear about these amazing places in present-day North Carolina and North Georgia and Eastern Tennessee. And we don't hear about these beautiful places, frankly, in Oklahoma. What's the relationship then, Julie, between land and identity for Cherokee people? And then by all means, let's get into the caves. So, and how does this factor into all of what this means to educate?
Yeah. So, I should, how do I want to say that? I was the child of an enlisted military guy. So I moved a lot as a kid, right? That doesn't mean that you don't take notice of the places that you live, but I got comfortable not being rooted. You know,
Right.
academia. My daughter has moved more as a young person than I moved the whole time my dad was in the military, right? Like, so as a child of an academic, she's been displaced a lot too. And I think there's a way that like home gets more complicated if you are constantly on the move, right? Like, what is home? Where is home? So I do think that my comfort with moving also made me um, blinded. I mean, that's probably the best word, is blinded to the power of place, right? Like, and so, and yet at the same time, I think Indigenous communities have challenged us to think about the long histories of place and people's connections to those places. So in some ways, this is alert, you know, like it's so ignorant of me, right? Like it's so ignorant. And on the other hand, that it goes to show like the learning that we have to do. So I would say the caves, it wasn't that I didn't know land mattered, right? I'd already
Sure.
been to Gadua a lot. I'd already been to the mountains a lot. I already had, you know, spent most of my summers in Oklahoma as a kid. Like it wasn't that place didn't matter. It was that I don't think I understood it. I don't think lessons had taken root, right? And so the going into the caves in kind of North Georgia, you know, South Tennessee, Northern Alabama.
God's country. Just say it.
Yeah,
It's perfect. Oh, I love it.
There's a way in which I had to think about not just Cherokee history, because some of these caves have evidence of much longer human interactions,
Sure.
right? That there were woodlands peoples that were in these caves. You know, ancestral Native Southerners were in these caves, and Indigenous peoples were coming into these spaces over long spans of time. Added to that, things like just cave structures, right? Like stalactites and stalagmites, like where you're looking at things that formed over thousands of years. That there is a kind of age of these spaces that challenges those of us who do history in 40-year spans or in centuries, or in like that we simply can't contain the land in these chronological boxes the way that we would, you know, the Civil War era, right? Like that it became clear, you know, it became really clear to me that I didn't understand something about the land.
Mm-hmm.
And the caves kind of, you know, beyond just kind of, you know, obviously I'd been writing for years and understood that, like, oh, ancestral Cherokees understood that there were these three levels to the world, right? This lower world, this middle world where humans are living in this upper world, right? But when you're in the caves, there's a way in which I was like, oh, wait a minute. I understand that. Like I'm standing between realms of the world in a cave, right? That there was something, you know, the land in that moment became a teacher that a book couldn't be, or that hearing something couldn't be. And so when you think about the kind of depths of knowledge, and to your point, kind of the traditional ecological knowledge, that when you've studied a place and information has been passed down over millennia, that you have to understand that land has taught you things and has been a teacher to you in a way that that you have to grapple with. And so it just completely altered how I could understand the chronology of the book. Like I just was like, I can't write a history of schooling. And of course, the caves we were in, as we started to do the research, realized that Sequoia's son had written in one of these caves. There's no evidence that Sequoia himself wrote in the caves, but it's near where he was residing. We know that he was in the region. We know that these are places where he was living and thinking about and finishing the syllabary. But what that also does is it says, like, Sequoia, like students of Sequoia or people that are adopting the syllabary are going in to places that are really old for Indigenous people.
Mm-hmm.
And this isn't this isn't a starting point. This isn't schooling and education and missions. This is longitudinally something that is much, much older, that is continuing at the same time that you have a new technology that's being introduced. And, we love as ethnohistorians changes and continuities. And for me, this was like one of those places where I just was like, how do I make sense of the changes and continuities that coexist in this space in ways that I can't even comprehend? And that changed everything. It literally changed how I thought about everything.
You talk in the book about epic learning. Is this, I'm very familiar with the idea, certainly, of generational trauma when I talk with tribal members I've worked with in my own career. Is this really kind of what we're keying in on here? Like, can we kind of pull this idea out? Is this where we're going with this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think some of it relates to historic trauma, that that there, that I think obviously, like, epigenetics helping us,
sure.
like, helping non-Indigenous people kind of grapple with some of this stuff. But I think for me it's even more than that. That I think it does go back to I mean, and I say this a lot in, like, survey classes, right? Where we're like, oh, science is finally catching up to things that Indigenous people have been saying forever, right? That, like, but I think it is dismissive to some, like, I'll give you an example out of the caves, that there is writing on the ceiling of the caves that is impossible to get to unless you were to build a structure or you were to have kind of a pulley and lever system. This is deep in caves. These are pitch black portions of caves. So, part of me is like, we've got to think about the engineering that went into this. I mean, we have backup safety measures today. If I'm going to go in a cave, there are safety measures that you have to have if you're going to go into caves. So the engineering, the practices, the intellectual knowledge that is evidenced by what's happening in those caves speaks to me about, like, almost, I think about it too as kind of pushing back on the mythology of caves, where everybody in the South wants to, like, market their show cave with, like, this is the lost cave that Cherokees secretly met in, and then some 10-year-old boy in the 20th century discovered, right? Like, so there's a kind of trope around these things. But I think there's both truth and falsity in that, right? Like, that the reality is that Cherokee people and ancestral Cherokees and Native Southerners more broadly have long histories of engagement with these spaces, engineering that went into navigating these spaces, that is epic in nature in and of itself. That there is knowledge that is accrued over time. And I wanted to take that seriously as much as I wanted to take seriously the pain and disruption that comes from losing an environment that you and your people have been studying and intimately connected to for millennia. That, to me, both of those go hand in hand. That we can't possibly understand historic trauma if we don't understand the commitments to those places and what's lost when you're no longer there.
This brings up the idea to me that, Chota is underwater. And that just breaks my heart whenever I think about it. And I'm certainly not Cherokee. I'm not tied to that particular space in the way that, say, Cherokee tribal members are. But for those listening, Chota is this incredibly important town in Cherokee culture that you can't get there anymore unless you're in a John boat. It's like, that's got to be incredibly infuriating. As a Cherokee woman, though, who's a member of the Cherokee Nation, which is located in Oklahoma, is there still then a tie, then, Julie, to going to places like Gadua? Is there a sense of, like, this is home, but also home is over here? Like, how does that work for you?
So, this is where I feel lucky feels like the most understated word ever. That that my educational trajectory, but also my engagement with these places because of living in the South and moving through the South, that I have a relationship to the Eastern Band and to those lands. And I also have a relationship to Oklahoma and the Cherokee Nation and the UKB, right? That not everyone has those same relationships. Not everybody has been necessarily to the homelands, or not everybody has been to Oklahoma. That there's a way in which you don't even know the other space, right? But what I think I say in the book, like I am a graduate of seminary. I went to seminary and lost all my religion, but I'm not an atheist. I'm an agnostic, and part of that is the sense. I just drove back from Oklahoma to the homelands less than a week ago, and I got to the mountains and immediately felt this kind of sense of ease. Right, that like there's just a breath that I get to take of like, being here, and I don't remember if I ended up keeping this particular line, but it is a way that I've come to kind of think about this, that the homelands are a place that hug me, and Oklahoma is a place I go to be hugged. And that's how I understand both of these places. And I've had discussions with Cherokee Nation folks who have been raised in the Cherokee Nation, and they are deeply committed to Oklahoma and deeply committed to that place and that home that we've made in Indian Territory, now Oklahoma. And at the same time, I've tried to articulate to them, but there's something incredibly special and deep about the homelands that I don't always know how to convey, because it feels so important. And I want everybody to experience both places, because I think they are just so incredibly important to who we are as Cherokee people today. Whether we're part of the Eastern Band and we're spared removal, or whether we now find our home in Oklahoma and Indian, what became Indian Territory.
There's a third aspect to this book, language. And Julie, when I ask you this as a man who can barely speak English on his own, can we talk about this idea? Can you be Cherokee without learning the language? Like, what does language mean, or language we talk a lot about language revitalization now. How important is linguistics, language, to maintaining Cherokee, sovereignty?
Yeah. I think okay. So I would say, I don't know many Cherokee people who would say out loud that they don't value and think language revitalization is incredibly important. And I think, I'm speaking to Cherokee Nation at this point, but like all of our chiefs, regardless of what political persuasion they've been, have been committed to language revitalization. Maybe not in the same ways, but all of them have committed resources and programs to language revitalization. So I think there's a consistency in leadership, and I would say this is true of the Eastern Band as well, to making sure that we are keeping language as a part of children's lives, and making resources available to our elders who continue to speak the language, and finding ways to kind of merge all of those speakers and future speakers together. But I also think about the sheer lack of speakers that we have. That going back to COVID, like that
we lost a lot of elders.
We lost 200 speakers out of 2,000. Like, that loss can't fully be understood. And what I guess feels like so important, and so that, again, kind of zooming out as a Native historian, I think how lucky we are that we have that many speakers left, right? When I think about other communities who have no speakers, right? Don't have languages, are going back to like records to try to bring their languages back, right? That's a very different situation. And on the other hand, we lost 200 speakers out of 2,000.
Yeah.
Like, how do we even grapple with that kind of loss? And so so I can zoom out and then zoom back in and think like we are still so in danger of losing something that is so vital. Now, I say all that as a somebody who's not a Cherokee speaker, right? I feel like I'm 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, and that's been my entire existence because we know that language is not about sure, I can study it as a singular person, but if I'm not in community speaking with other people, I'm not learning it,
Yeah.
right? I'm not really learning it. And so I remain committed to it. And I'm excited to take my classes and get back into it in a way that I had not been able to be. And I look to people that are far, like thinking about Ben Fry,
So great.
thinking about Candace Teehee, thinking about people that I know that are my peers who are doing incredible work around language revitalization that I continue to look to kind of inspire me and keep me pushing no matter how hard it is. I will say, and I don't want to get into like, I think there's arguments that people want to have about like, do you continue to be native if you don't have a language? Do you, that I think is not fair, right? That there's like legacies of colonialism mean that some of our communities do not have language, right? And I'm not going to dismiss a community because of that. On the other hand, I understand that there are histories embedded in the language, that if we lose the language, we lose whole parts of our history, that there are pieces that are just there. There are conceptions of the world that are in the language that can't be replicated into English. And so losing it means that we lose a whole set of primary documents, thinking about it as a historian, but like we lose a whole set of ways of understanding the world that are fundamentally different from how other people conceive of the world. And so I think the stakes are enormous. And, I may never be a speaker, but by golly, it's my responsibility to keep learning.
I love that. I want to ask you about a linguistic term about a place thing to you as a woman, so I can get all 3 of these things under the same thing. What about place names, Julie? Gwohi was recently had its name restored, not renamed, but its name restored. Yeah. It's this beautiful mountain in Western North Carolina. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
It was. I couldn't get up there the day I was there because it was blocked off because of all the ice. Can we talk a little bit about the importance of restoring Indigenous place names, not just in Cherokee country, but across North America?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think Kuohi is a great example. That I think there are a variety of reasons that Kuohi is a great example. Like I think about some of the people that I know behind the scenes were Cherokee women. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about Kim Smith, who was a student here at the University of Tennessee, who I got to meet, who has been a part of that process and whose daughters have been a part of that process. So some of the people that I know that have been some of the greatest advocates for this are Cherokee women working behind the scenes, kind of trying to get this work done. So I think about it from that sense, but I also think about place names as like what can we learn about that place as a result of its place name, that its English name or the name that took over doesn't tell us about that place, right? That in the same way that naming a place Clingman's Dome, right? That tells us something, but we're missing a whole part of how Cherokees understood that place over a longer piece of time. But there's also, I think about places like, places that have names that are descriptors, like that are, the mulberry place, like that we've got to think about, like, oh my goodness, this is telling us about food sources. Yep. It's telling us about medicinal plants. It's telling us about, that there are whole things that we lose that if we don't know these indigenous place names and we don't try to keep them intact, that are not just important, like these could be important for all of us ecologically as we think about sustainability, or we think about climate change, or we think about like how are we going to move forward in a world, and how do we live more sustainably? These might be the answers, right? Like, so, and so if we erase the kind of larger knowledge system that is embedded in place names, then we're at a loss. We're all at a loss, not just Cherokee people.
Thank you. I was doing a little dance in my head because I remembered that it was Mulberry Place right before, but it reveals the intimacy of this space, right? That that there are mulberries there, that you go there and all that. And all I can think about was, recently we had a naming ceremony back on top of Pikes Peak out here in Colorado.
Mm.
And my friend Amanda Hill, who is TIPO director at Kiowa Tribe, she's like, look, our name for this mountain is White Mountain. Where's the snow, Jason? We have problems here. And it's the simplest things like that,
Yeah.
It's like,
yeah,
it's right there. I want to ask you, kind of as we're kind of coming towards an end here, we talked a little bit about, things that you want to put in the book and stuff. You've been working on this book for a while now. There's all kinds of stuff that doesn't go into a book. Are there stories here or parts of this book that you were like, oh man, this is going to go elsewhere? Were there pieces here that got left on the cutting room floor? What else do you want to talk about that maybe didn't make it into the book itself?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's no way to be able to talk about this book without that. Yes, this is a book about women. But as I was heading down the finish line, and Mark Simpson Voss, who was at UNC Press, who I worked with through almost all of the process, I had gotten through my 6th chapter, and I was like, I got to get this book out. And I haven't looked at these 1970s archives moving forward. There's too many records. There's too much. I sat down with him. This was early November. He was up in State College. I said, I don't have a girl. I don't know who the girl's going to be. Like, I haven't looked at the records. I don't know. And I was like, and Mark, I've got to get this book out. And Mark looked at me and he said, you do have a girl. And I rejected that immediately. And I said, no, I don't. And I understood what he meant, but there's a way in which we're discouraged from sharing who we really are. So much of what we do is performance. And 2 weeks later, my dad died. And I wrote that final chapter of the book in days. And I wasn't sure about it, but I have kept an archive of my childhood. I started keeping it when I was about 3 years old, because apparently I have some issues I need to sort out in therapy, but I'm working on it. But it was, random stuff. I mean, not kind of, yes, it had report cards and things like that, but it was truly something that I had curated. And I pulled out these records that, the first thing I pulled out was, again, it's not in any order. It's not organized. It's just crap that I've put in a box for decades. And the first thing I pull out is my creative writing notebook from my freshman year in high school, which talked about the Oka crisis, right? The Kanawha resistance. And I thought, oh my gosh, like, here's the first thing I pull out. Like, this is what's in there. But then I also had to pull out, I had to grieve my father through these records, right? And he was a hard person. Like, he was a hard person to grow up with. I mean, at the tail end of his life, I couldn't ask for a better relationship with my dad, but he was a hard father growing up. And so there were pages and pages of trying to grapple and write through my grief, and write through my childhood that didn't make it. And that I had to say to Mark at a certain point, this is too close. Like, I need your help because this is all important to me. And I need to I need to figure out what the argument is, right? Like, I need to figure out what the argument is. And part of this book was my dad's eulogy. I lifted portions of this book for my dad's eulogy. And so yes, this book is about honoring my mom because she's been so formative in my life, and so have teachers and schools, and that's where I live, right? I live in this world of academia. But so many of my questions came, the origin story is a birth certificate. His birth certificate. And how do you put that in a book? How do you put a lifetime of why we do what we do in a book? And I think so many of us don't, we're often told that we're all doing this work because we're just interested in historic topics. And that has never been my story. That has never been the story of why I'm interested in history. My interest in history is because Wilma Mankiller showed me that Cherokees mattered in history. My interest in history is because Theta took me on as a graduate student. Like, my story has never been, I'm just so curious about all history everywhere. I can't say that. And then how do I tell the story that is very much about my family and about, that are simultaneously about this moment and that take me back to generations ago, right? And so, yeah, there's a lot that's not in there. And yeah, I mean, I think we don't often get to do that through our works. And I'm grateful that this book gets to honor so many of the people that have meant so much to me.
Julie, we've spent the last hour and 20 minutes talking about the past, about the present. What's in the future for you? What comes next?
I'm unapologetically a historian of Cherokee people and Cherokee history, and I'm not going to veer away from that. I'm working on a co-authored book with Rose Drumlau, who's at Davidson.
Love her.
And we are writing a kind of comprehensive history of the Cherokee Nation, and so that's kind of the next project. But I also, that there's a lot I continue to think about and work on. I've made this move to Oklahoma, and part of that is that I have been blessed with being in great institutions that have given me a lot of support, and I understand how many of my counterparts in the academy have not had that, and so I'm conscious of that, and at the same time I'm trying to also think about like where do I have the most to give, and how do I sustain the kind of energy that's necessary to do this work for a few more decades, right? When we're all stretched so thin in this moment that we exist in, regardless of whether we're in the academy or not. And so I want to continue working with ally students. I want to continue working with people who care about Native South and Indian Territory and Oklahoma and the Native West. But I also want to work with Indigenous students. I want to involve my undergrads in projects that serve communities on a regular basis. And so part of the move to Tulsa was an ability to do more of that all the time, as opposed to, oh, great, I'm teaching this public history class, I can collaborate with the Cherokee Nation on an exhibit. Like, I love that, and it was important, but I want to do that work. I want to be able to give a little bit more on the everyday part of my life to Five Tribes history, and that's where my strengths are. So, again, I'm back in the East doing language and archaeology, and I continue to think about that work, and I continue to think about these kind of big longitudinal stretches of Indigenous history in the Native South, and then beyond that, like I have at least a fourth project that I have in the back of my head that is it's a Cherokee Princess project. Let me say that.
Naturally.
Yeah. But yeah, so that, I mean, there's hopefully there's a lot more community engaged scholarship in my immediate future. And so that's what's up.
Well, I'm glad, because now that you're in Oklahoma, I get to go to Oklahoma, and the chances are I'll see you more than in just an airport for 10 minutes.
Right.
I want to leave you with one thing before we go, which is this. I did a lot of prep work on this pod. I really wanted to do a good job for you. I read your book. And then I started off telling you about my best friend, who you know, when we started talking today. And I said, Chris, what's Julie like? And she said, I want to quote her to you. She says, quote, I love her because I've known her for 20 years and she's always been humble, kind, and brilliant. That's my best friend talking about you. And I don't trust anybody more than I trust her. And yeah.
I don't take compliments well. So I'm gonna take that gratitude, because that means a lot. I mean, I feel like we all are so separate so often that we have to kind of have these fleeting relationships at conferences, and we don't always have the time to be able to have the conversations that are beyond just like, oh, how's the book coming? So I'm grateful that I have a crew of Native South scholars out there in the world who
I'm still clinging on,
like Crystalline. Yeah. And so I know Crystalline cares, again, like those of us that care about the Native South and care about ethnohistory and care about Indigenous peoples broadly, that like, what a field we work in.
Yeah. Julie, told you this when I emailed you. It means the world to me that you would trust me to come on the show and talk about Cherokee culture and history and people and women and places. Thank you for being here. I can't wait for people to hear this. Guys, that was absolutely amazing. What an awesome conversation we just had with Julie. Thank you so very much to Julie Reed for coming in. And Julie, it's an honor to be trusted by you to help share this amazing Cherokee story. Thank you for being here and sharing that with us today. Thank you, of course, to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run and for helping to amplify the stories that you hear on this podcast. And most of all, always thank you to all of you for continuing to be here, to support this movement, to support this show and keep it running. Thank you for sharing. If you like this pod, make sure you subscribe to it. If you really like the pod, make sure you leave a comment. If you really, really like the pod, make sure you leave a good comment and keep listening. We have so many more amazing stories coming for you soon. We'll catch you next time. Ciao for now. Bye.